the pioneers of one of the most revered extreme metal genres of all time. From stories of Satan and the occult to Nordic warriors and even the Norse god himself, the mighty Odin, one man would be at the forefront of this groundbreaking genre, leading the charge into what would become black metal. With one of the most iconic album covers in heavy metal, instantly recognizable, combined with a sound like no other. Telling these ancient tales, the ever-mysterious Quorthon at the helm, guiding this chariot of hellfire, kicking and screaming into the modern world. This is Storm of Damnation, the story of Bathory.
Okay, you just sit down, relax, and you're about to see Sweden being Christianized.
Scandinavia and the Nordics have given us some of the most extreme and pioneering metal music to date. Most would instantly conjure up the now iconic image of Dead and Euronymous from Mayhem, a group that became infamous for church burnings and murder. Mayhem are also considered to be one of the most influential artists in the black metal movement. However, as I discussed in my documentary of them, if it wasn't for the media attention and the horrific events that surrounded them, would they have really been that big in the first place? This is also something that I feel has always cast a bit of a shadow on not just one band, but one man. Venom and Merciful Fate are without doubt seen as the progenitors of what would become black metal. They laid the template, so to speak. Yet the black metal sound would come to be something rather different. For many, the true black metal sound would be encapsulated in one album, and that album would be the self-titled debut record by Bathory, released in 1984. Many hail this record as the true beginning of black metal music. It had all of the musical hallmarks of what people would come to recognize as black metal. Bathory was part of the first wave of black metal that also included Venom and Merciful Fate, yet had a very different sound altogether for some aspects of the music, such as the vocals, for instance. Compare all three and you can quite clearly hear something distinctive in each one. The vocal, at least for Bathory, has a pretty simple explanation. In the beginning, during the first 6 months of the band, I sang more in a natural way, and then the microphone broke. We didn't have money to buy new ones, so I picked up the guitar and sang through the guitar microphone, through a few distortion boxes and through a Marshall amp, so it sounded quite cool, so I kept it that way. You just need to scream. You'll stand and scream for half an hour to warm it up. To get it really hoarse, you put the mic 3 meters up, slightly above you, and face the sky vertically. So just exactly where did Bathory's unique sound come from, and how did it develop in the first place? Well, for that, we need to start our journey in my favorite place in the world, Sverige, or Sweden. Thomas Börje Forsberg was born in Stockholm, Sweden in 1966, or as he is more commonly known as simply Quorthon. This name comes from something called the Black Bible that he read around this time. Thomas would have been just 17 years old when Bathory would officially form. On Wednesday the 16th of March 1983, the first Bathory lineup would embark on the first Bathory rehearsal at a local music store in Kungsholmen in Stockholm. Quorthon had placed little ads in local music shops looking for band members that wanted to create music in the style of The Exploited, GBH, Motörhead and Black Sabbath. I remember looking for musicians outside my then natural punk circuits. All the metal musicians I knew were either not exactly what I was looking for, or not vacant, or simply not interested in the ideas I had for a band. When you're that age, 16 to 17 years old, due to a lack of life experience, you're pretty much fundamental about a lot of things, and even small details may make a huge difference. I would discard a bass player back then if he was into stuff like Maiden or would perm his hair. Whilst the new wave of British heavy metal was taking over from the late 70s, Thomas had his sights set on a very different genre, and that genre would be punk. He was even in a punk band before Bathory. Sadly though, there doesn't appear to be even a rough demo from this group for me to play you. I didn't look oi punk, but I was listening more to that stuff than I did new wave of British heavy metal in the year prior to forming Bathory. Apart from listening to Kiss when growing up, all I knew about metal around the time starting Bathory was basically Motörhead and Black Sabbath. By that time in 1981 and 1982, I had literally played my Motörhead albums to bits, and my Black Sabbath records would barely hold together. So whatever it was I'd form one day, it was basically bound to be something that picked up from where I felt Motörhead and Black Sabbath had come to a halt. Motörhead, of course, have been noted as the band that helped to push a new style of aggressive music. It wasn't quite punk, it wasn't quite metal, it was Motörhead. Motörhead, Overkill, Bomber, and of course Ace of Spades had already made a huge impact on the world of metal before Bathory had formed. Bathory would even record a very interesting cover of Ace of Spades released many years later in 1997. And then we have some UK punk influence with the likes of The Exploited and GBH. In '82, a friend of mine borrowed me a tape containing the then newly released GBH album, City Baby Attacked by Rats. I was caught completely off guard by parts of that album. Here was the sound and energy that I had been looking for. That album would have as much an effect on me as Ace of Spades and was very important for the course that Bathory would take right from the outset. We of course cannot forget to mention one of the most influential groups of all time. So many metalheads just love to hate. One of my personal favorites, Kiss. Quorthon also chose one of his first stage names as Ace Forsberg, after Ace Frehley of Kiss. To this day, the Never Mind the Bollocks album is the album I listen to the most frequently besides Kiss Alive, but hearing GBH in late '82, early '83 was something completely different and a booster when it came to finally deciding on forming the band. Kiss Alive was the first live record by Kiss released in 1975, and this is actually the reason a lot of rock and metal musicians became rock and metal musicians in the first place. Whether you love them or hate them, this is one of the most influential records to have ever been released. In terms of GBH, a UK punk band formed in 1978, and also considered to be pioneers of the genre, Quorthon specifically named tracks such as Sick Boy, War Dogs, and I Am the Hunted as direct influences on early Bathory. And from the catalogue of The Exploited, he named tracks such as UK 82, Jimmy Boyle, and They Won't Stop as more direct influences on early Bathory. Although Venom are often cited as the sole influence of black metal, Quorthon always stuck to his story of where the real influence for Bathory came from. Bathory's roots were closer to oi punk than anything else. Mix the sound and style of Motörhead with the gloom and darkness of Black Sabbath, and let that rest on a solid base of GBH. What you get is something that's raw, primitive, noisy, and intense early Bathory. And now we have the heavily debated influence of Venom. Venom, of course, are cited as the first black metal band, and their second studio record, Black Metal, released in 1982, is noted as the first black metal record, and the very reason the genre developed in the first place. And whilst many groups had based their ideas and concepts on Venom in the early days, Quorthon has always denounced them as being an influence. The funny thing was, later when asked about how much of an influence on Bathory that Venom might have been, and I told people I heard Venom for the first time after the release of the first Bathory album, people just wouldn't believe me. And when I mentioned GBH, nobody knew what the hell I was talking about. Not that it matters much today, but those who still disbelieve me, I'll be happy to inform any disbeliever that I know for a fact I heard a Venom album for the first time just after the release of the first Bathory album. Whichever way you want to look at it, Bathory's influence through punk, Black Sabbath and Motörhead alone would have been more than enough to inspire any teenager to concoct the type of sound that Bathory would deliver, along with their broken microphones helping to conjure up the extremely unique vocal sonic. And from their first rehearsal on the 16th of March 1983, it would take just 12 months before we saw the birth of the true satanic black metal ghost. In March of 1984, a heavy metal compilation record was released called Scandinavian Metal Attack. It featured songs by Swedish and Finnish bands such as Oz, Spitfire, Trash, and 09. This record also marks the first ever official release of a Bathory song. This is that record, an original pressing from 1984, still in pretty good shape, and it actually features two Bathory songs. Sacrifice, track 3, and The Return of the Darkness and Evil as the last track. I can play a little bit of this in some clips to try and give you a rough idea of what this might have sounded like if you were a teenager in Scandinavia, having just bought this record, trying to discover the latest underground heavy metal bands. Now, according to Law, the record label received a lot of fan mail back from this release, with basically everyone saying that Bathory was the best band on the album. Not really surprising, and we'll know what comes next. In 1984, the self-titled debut studio album by Bathory would be unleashed on Earth. It was recorded shortly after the release of Scandinavian Metal Attack in a converted garage in Stockholm, Sweden. And this was for many the very first full black metal record. It signified the combination of Satanism with the aesthetics of skulls, bones, and satanic rituals with the sound of black metal in a way that hadn't been heard before. In 1981, we had Venom, Welcome to Hell, which was essentially the first template for what would become black metal. 1982, again, we had Venom with their second studio album, Black Metal. Then in 1983, we had the debut record from Merciful Fate, Melissa, Slaughter in Hell by Antichrist, and of course, Hellhammer with Satanic Rites. All of these records either helped to lay down the roots for black metal or came very close to sounding like what would become the black metal sound most people recognize as black metal today. Bathory was clearly unique in not only the Swedish scene but worldwide. If you talk about black metal, you talk about Bathory. Every black metal band is inspired by Bathory. There was nothing before them. They were the ones who set the sound. They did the combination of open devil worship, black magic, and didn't sing about it as something you should distance yourself from, but the opposite. And then in 1984 is the debut record by Bathory, Celtic Frost also released their first album, Morbid Tales, in the same year. We have Hellhammer with Apocalyptic Raids and Don't Break the Oath by Merciful Fate. And when we stack these records up next to each other, to me at least, it is blindingly obvious which one sounds like black metal in its purest form, although I hate that saying. I'm certainly not denouncing any of the other records as not being black metal. Bathory just had more of a cohesive and unique sound that was instantly recognizable and very distinctive from, say, thrash and general heavy metal or any hard rock. This was the birth of the black metal sound. There was nothing else like it. This is probably the most well-known cover for the debut Bathory album, but the original first pressing actually features a yellow goat, as Quorthon wanted it to be gold. And where does the goat come from exactly? Well, on January the 1st, 1982, an American author by the name of Erica Young published a book called Witches. One of the illustrations in the book by Joseph A. Smith was this seemingly looking demonic goat, which I have to assume was based on Baphomet. And one thing I love about this album is the record label it was released on. The official name of the label was Black Mark Label, but this was owned by Typhoon. Now, Typhoon, or Typhoon in English, was a Swedish label that released music by Swedish dance band artists. I guess you could call it Swedish country music. I just think it's amazing that this type of music and the debut black metal record by Bathory are so closely connected in this way. Stig Börje Forsberg, the father of Thomas Börje Forsberg Quorthon, I believe actually owned this label. And if you look at who produced the first Bathory record, you'll see a credit go to The Boss, Quorthon's father. Another little interesting connection here as well is the album Oz by The Oz, released in 1982. One of the groups that featured on the Scandinavian Metal Attack compilation gives credit to Thomas Ace Forsberg as an album designer and other recording ideas, whatever that means. So I think we also have to give thanks to the late, great Börje Forsberg, Quorthon's father, for the first black metal record seeing the light of day as well. Now, let's get back to Satan. Satan, Lucifer, Beelzebub, the devil, all names to which we have come to know as the once fallen angel of heaven that rains chaos down on humankind, and also has a long and deep-rooted history within not just heavy metal, but music in general. We have the infamous story of Robert Johnson selling his soul to the devil. The Rolling Stones released Sympathy for the Devil in 1968, and a year before released their Satanic Majesty's Request. And we have Coven, who I've spoken about many times before, the American psychedelic rock band from the 60s that released one of the first records ever known to present the devil horn hand gesture on album artwork, which is now familiarized with heavy metal culture. Bathory would continue this tradition of referencing all things evil with the very first song that was ever written for the group. The first song we ever finished was called Satan Is My Master, and it sounded like Symptom of the Universe by Black Sabbath. The lyrics were ridiculous. The same week we did Witchcraft, and shortly after, Sacrifice. The other two guys were more into Whitesnake, Iron Maiden, and Saxon. They actually wanted me to write such stuff instead. So what about Satan and black metal? Well, it's no secret that some black metal bands are indeed satanic in nature, or at least have close connections with this dark figure of history. King Diamond, singer of Merciful Fate, who has been very open over the years about his following of Satanism. Then we have Mayhem, whose former singer Dead was an active Satanist and was even looking to join satanic cults. Venom, the first black metal group, even used satanic imagery on their very first album. And even Slayer relied heavily on the satanic narrative. However, most of the groups you see worshipping the devil are doing it for shock value. It's more of a marketing gimmick than really wanting to sacrifice people to our Lord Satan. So what about Bathory? After all, the image of the cover of the debut album bears a striking resemblance to Baphomet, a now well-known icon in the underworld of all things satanic. Even the song titles alone would be enough to convince any parent that their child might be drawing blood pentagrams all over their bedroom walls. Hades, Reaper, Necromancy, and a song quite literally called In Conspiracy with Satan. How can Bathory not be a satanic following? Well, it seemed that Quorthon also understood the power of shock rock. The thing about bones and skulls, okay, skulls have been a part of the image since quite some time, but the thing about dressing up in bones and other accessories was just a private and cheap image that I adapted. The economic possibilities made it so that we couldn't come up with anything more expensive. The bones were just a cheap gimmick, and now it has become a cult thing in the United States. People running around with bones around their necks, it's real bones. Although part of this was a gimmick, some of the imagery and inspiration for songs did indeed come from Quorthon's fascination with Satanism and the occult. Witchcraft, I remember, as basically our own version of Motörhead's Overkill, sans the double bass drums, since that really wasn't regarded as oi or punk. And Satan My Master was inspired by this underground book I had just read on Satanists during the 15th century and their rituals. The lyrics were basically straight from a blood sermon in that book. Now, of course, Venom also had songs with titles such as Welcome to Hell, In League with Satan, and Sons of Satan, as well as looking like they really did worship the devil, but Venom, it was just part of the image. Whereas Bathory had more mystery about them, which I think helped to add a real connection with the satanic theme. So Satanism and occultism in general certainly did play a huge role in shaping Bathory's image and music, especially throughout the first record. Only 1,000 copies of the now coveted Yellow Goat album cover were pressed, and it sold out within 2 weeks. The record itself only cost 5,000 Swedish kronor to record, which was about $700 at the time. Now, having not been there, it's difficult to know what kind of impact this record had upon its initial release in 1984. We do know that a second pressing was issued in the same year in Sweden with the white goat cover, and subsequent pressings were released in Canada and the US in 1985, the UK in 1987, and even a bootleg cassette version saw some circulation in Germany in 1989. I guess the first thing is that we're Swedish, that we haven't to go in the same direction as American, German, or English bands. The second reason was possibly that there were no pictures around, and the third thing was that there were a lot of rumors going around in interviews that made us more interesting, and we were very early. And if you know anything about music from back in the day, if your records are being bootlegged, you can be sure there is a demand for it. And again, I think the mystery of the group helped to spur this on. There were no band photos in this record like you would commonly find on literally every other LP of that era, and also no names written on the record to identify who the band was. And this was simply because there was no band. Upon the release of Bathory's debut album, the other two members had already left, and it was just Quorthon. So this one happy coincidence created a certain mystique around the LP. Bathory's debut album has become one of the most influential records of all time when it comes to extreme music. It really did set the precedent for what would become black metal as we know it. And Quorthon had just turned 18 upon its release. So how could you possibly top this? Being just 18 years of age, recording one of the greatest metal records of all time and essentially helping to invent an entirely new genre. What next?
Yes, one road to Mars Bay.
Well, you invent another one. During the mid-80s, Quorthon would release 3 records with Bathory that would focus on the traditional concept of black metal. Their debut in 1984, the return of the Darkness and Evil in 1985, and Under the Sign of the Black Mark in 1987. All 3 records indulged in occultist and satanic themes and stories and are now often associated with black metal. However, Quorthon simply became somewhat jaded with his interest for Satanism and realized it was just as fake as Christianity. It actually started with the decline of enthusiasm for yet another full-length album packed with screams of Satan. All this due to the fact that I came to the personal conclusion that this whole satanic bit was a fake, a hoax created by another hoax, the Christian church. And so there was this thing created by the church, or Christianity if you like, to herd the terrified world into its arms and cathedrals. A thing like the satanic or occult dish is bound to work well as a bad motherfucker or main ingredient for your lyrics. Usually old gods and religions were turned into bad ones, and the Christian image of a bad anti-god was swiftly accepted by the uneducated mobs of 11th century Europe. This is what seems to have nurtured Quorthon's rediscovery of the old Norse gods, and in 1988, Bathory would release their 4th studio album, Blood, Fire, Death. This is seen to be one of the first examples of a record focused on Viking metal. Sonically, it still had all of the classic elements of black metal, but if you look a little closer, we have some obvious signs of development in terms of the theme. This is a painting called The Wild Hunt of Odin, created by the Norwegian historical painter Peter Nikolai Arbo. Born in 1831, he painted this work in 1872. This painting essentially depicts Odin and also Thor, both ancient Norse gods, in a chaotic event that took place between Christmas and New Year's Eve. We also see in the image ghosts, restless dead souls, and also trolls who apparently ride the midwinter sky and abduct people that have failed to find refuge. This image would be the album cover for Bathory's Blood, Fire, Death record, and the first song would be titled Odin Ride Over Nordland. Second track on the album, A Fine Day to Die, also follows a similar tale of Nordic legend, referring to campfires, swords and axes, and ancient battles. And throughout the album, these Nordic themes continue. This is one of the earliest examples of what you would call Viking metal. Although we do have Sign of the Hammer by Manowar, released in 1984, that we could easily link to the Norse god Thor, the music itself definitely had more of an affiliation to heavy metal in general, almost new wave of British heavy metal, in fact. So it was once again Quorthon and Bathory that had fused an extreme metal genre with what I guess you could call a new narrative within the heavy metal world by focusing on Norse mythology. Viking metal didn't exactly take off in the same way that black metal did, and Bathory continued to exist really in their own right in terms of unique sound throughout the 80s and 90s. Many would come to see Bathory's 5th studio album Hammerheart, released in 1990, as the true sound of Viking metal, and you only have to listen to it to understand why. Bathory would release 12 studio albums, the first being the now iconic self-titled Goat covered record in 1984 that became the true template for what would become black metal, and the final Bathory record would be Nordland 2, released in 2003. And sadly, we all know why this was the last Bathory record. Thomas Börje Forsberg died in his apartment in Stockholm, Sweden in 2004. The cause of death was apparently due to an undiagnosed heart defect. Quorthon was just 38 years of age when he passed, without doubt taken far too soon. However, he left a legacy that will echo on throughout the ages. All hail King Quorthon and his mighty Bathory.